One ship, armed with enough firepower to sink an aircraft carrier from over 300 miles away, displacing nearly 28,000 tons, powered by two nuclear reactors that never needed to refuel. The United States Navy had nothing built to fight it head-on. When American admirals proposed a rival, Congress killed the idea and bet on something smaller instead. This was a warship built around one ruthless philosophy: concentrate everything, missiles, armor, power, into a single hull so massive it could stand alone against an entire carrier strike group. That same philosophy would almost destroy it. Decades later, one of its sister ships would spend longer inside a shipyard being repaired than it ever spent at sea, defending a country that could no longer afford to keep it. Why would the Soviet Union build the most powerful surface warship on Earth, then nearly lose it to its own size? This is the Kirov-Class, built in Leningrad. Launched into an arms race no ship before it had tried to win alone. Nearly 50 years later, it is still trying to prove it was worth the cost. Long before there was a Kirov, there was a problem the Soviet Navy could not solve with ships alone. By the early 1960s, the United States sailed the oceans behind a shield the Soviets simply did not have: the aircraft carrier battle group, a floating air force that could project fighters, bombers, and radar coverage hundreds of miles from its own hull. The Soviet Union had submarines, missiles, and land-based bombers, but nothing that could sail alone into open ocean and survive an American carrier's air wing. Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, the man rebuilding the Soviet Navy into a blue-water force, understood the gap for what it was. Not a shortage of ships, but a shortage of ships that could fight without help. The task of closing that gap fell to the Severno Design Bureau in Leningrad, and to one engineer in particular, Boris Israelovich Kupensky. Kupensky was not an outsider or an unproven name. He had already built his reputation as a chief designer of the Soviet Union's first gas turbine destroyer, a program that dragged Soviet surface ship propulsion out of the coal and steam era and into the modern age. That project taught him something the Admiralty valued above almost anything else: how to take an unproven power system and turn it into a warship that actually worked. When the Navy needed someone to figure out how to put a nuclear reactor inside a surface combatant, for the first time in Soviet history, Kupensky was the obvious choice. The early design studies, beginning in the mid-1960s, did not look anything like the ship that would eventually carry the Kirov name. The first drafts called for a vessel of about 8,000 tons, classified simply as a large anti-submarine ship, built to hunt American missile submarines before they could launch. But as the design moved through the Severno Bureau's drafting tables year after year, the requirements kept expanding. Anti-submarine sensors were not enough. The Navy wanted anti-ship missiles capable of reaching an American carrier from over the horizon. It wanted air defense systems layered deep enough to survive an air wing's full strike package. Each new requirement added tons, and by the time the design was finally approved in 1971, the 8,000-ton anti-submarine ship had become something else entirely: a nuclear-powered cruiser standing at nearly 20,000 tons, still growing. That growth was not an accident, and it was not a failure of discipline. It was the philosophy taking shape. Kupensky and the Severno team were not designing a ship to fill one role in a larger fleet formation the way an American cruiser was built to escort a carrier. They were designing a ship that could be the formation. Every capability an American carrier group spread across a dozen hulls. An escort here, a submarine hunter there, a missile shooter somewhere else, would be folded into one hull, powered by a reactor that never needed to return to port for fuel. One ship, sent alone into the North Atlantic or the Pacific, expected to find an American carrier group and sink it, without a single friendly aircraft overhead. The Soviets had a name for this outlook long before Kirov ever touched water. The fleet did not need more ships spread thin across more missions. It needed fewer ships, each one dangerous enough to matter alone. Concentrate the firepower. Concentrate the armor. Concentrate the reactor power. Build a warship that never needed help, because help, in the vast carrier-dominated oceans the Soviet Navy was contesting, was never going to arrive in time. It was an elegant answer to an impossible problem. It was also, though no one in Leningrad could have known it yet, a decision that would take nearly 30 years and billions of dollars to fully repay. By the time American intelligence analysts got a clear look at what was taking shape on the slipways of the Baltic shipyard in Leningrad, the ship already had a problem. No existing part of the United States Navy was built to solve. The largest surface combatant in the American fleet built specifically as a cruiser was USS Long Beach, commissioned back in 1961, the world's first nuclear-powered surface warship. Long Beach had been a pioneer in her day, but by the mid-1970s, she was outdated, underarmed compared to what satellite photography now showed rising out of the water in Leningrad, and alone in her own class. Every other so-called American nuclear cruiser was, in truth, a destroyer or a frigate reclassified on paper to sound more impressive than it actually was. Against the ship the Soviets were building, none of them stood a chance in a straight fight, and everyone in the Pentagon knew it. The Soviet requirement, once Western analysts pieced it together, was staggering in its specificity. Standard displacement of roughly 24,000 tons, over 28,000 tons fully loaded, more than 800 feet in length, larger than almost anything that had ever been classified as a cruiser in naval history. Primary armament centered on 20 P-700 Granite missiles, NATO reporting name SS-N-19 shipwreck, each one capable of striking a target more than 300 nautical miles away at more than twice the speed of sound. Carrying either a conventional warhead heavy enough to cripple a warship outright or a nuclear payload. Layered beneath that offensive punch sat the S-300F Fort Air Defense System, giving the ship a surface-to-air missile umbrella dense enough to challenge an incoming carrier air wing on its own, backed by close-in gun systems, torpedo tubes, and a helicopter hangar for anti-submarine work. 2 nuclear reactors, supplemented by oil-fired boosters for maximum speed, gave the ship a cruising range limited only by food and crew endurance. No single American warship carried that combination of firepower, endurance, and self-sufficiency. None was designed to. The ship was laid down in 1974, launched in 1977, and by 1980 the first hull, named Kirov, after the Bolshevik revolutionary Sergei Kirov, was operational in the Soviet fleet. NATO's naval intelligence officers, faced with a warship too large and too heavily armed to fit any existing Western category, reached for a term the world had not used seriously since the Second World War: battlecruiser. The Soviet Navy itself never used that word, officially still calling it a large missile cruiser. But the NATO designation stuck. And it stuck for a reason. Nothing built since 1945 looked or fought like this. That left the United States Navy staring at a genuine strategic problem. And the response revealed exactly how differently the two superpowers thought about naval power. Navy planners drew up a real answer: a strike cruiser. A nuclear-powered, Aegis-equipped warship built specifically to match Kirov gun for gun, missile for missile. 2 paths were studied. One converted the aging Long Beach herself, adding the new Aegis radar and combat system for an estimated $800 million. The other built an entirely new class from the keel up, a ship called CGN-42, derived from the Virginia-class cruisers, and fitted with the full Aegis suite, at a projected cost of roughly $3 billion per hull, in an era already straining under Cold War defense spending. Then came the vote that decided the outcome of this entire chapter of naval history. The United States Congress looked at the price tag for a one-for-one answer to Kirov and said no, rather than build a small number of enormously expensive, enormously capable single ships. American planners bet on the opposite philosophy entirely: more hulls, each individually cheaper, networked together through the Aegis combat system, so that a formation of smaller warships could deliver collectively the same saturation of missile fire that Kirov carried inside one hull. The strike cruiser died in committee. The CGN-42 never left the drawing board. In its place came the Ticonderoga-class, an Aegis cruiser built on a destroyer hull, cheaper, smaller, and ultimately built by the dozen instead of a handful. For the Soviet Union, in the narrowest sense, this was a win. No American shipyard ever launched a direct answer to Kirov. No single Western warship was ever built to match her tonnage, her missile range, or her nuclear endurance in single combat. The Soviet Navy had forced the most powerful navy on Earth into a strategic retreat without firing a single shot. Simply by building something so expensive to counter directly that the alternative made more sense. It was, on paper, a total vindication of Kupensky's concentration doctrine. What no one in Leningrad had priced into that victory, yet was what it would cost to keep a ship like this alive for the next 50 years. When Kirov first sailed out of the Baltic and into open ocean in December 1980, NATO did not even have a name for her yet. Reconnaissance aircraft and intelligence ships shadowed the new cruiser as she moved west, and Western naval officers, working off grainy photographs and radar returns, gave her a placeholder designation before her real identity was even confirmed, Balcom-1, short for Baltic Combatant 1. It was an almost comically modest name for a ship this size, but it captured the confusion in NATO command in those first weeks. To the sailors and pilots who eventually got close enough to see her clearly, the scale was almost impossible to process at first glance. A hull longer than 2.5 football fields laid end to end. A superstructure rising as tall as a 10-story building above the waterline, moving through open ocean at better than 30 knots, without ever needing to slow down for fuel. Nobody was entirely sure what they were looking at. What they were sure of was that nothing built by any Western Navy came close to matching it. The ship did not sail alone for long, at least not in doctrine. Soviet naval planners never intended Kirov to fight a carrier group by herself. She was designed to be the flagship and command center of something far larger. A coordinated strike package built around the concept the Soviet Navy called the Reconnaissance Strike Complex. Using satellites and the long-range radar to locate an American carrier group, then converging on it from every direction at once. Kirov and her sister ships would anchor the surface component, their Granite missiles ready to fire the moment a target was confirmed. Oscar-class nuclear submarines, each one carrying 24 of the same Granite missiles, would approach from beneath the waves. Regiments of Tu-22M backfire bombers, flying low and fast, would launch their own anti-ship missiles from multiple bearings simultaneously. NATO planners eventually gave this three-pronged Soviet formation a name of their own. The Wolf Pack, a package of submarine, air, and surface threats designed to saturate an American carrier's defenses with more incoming missiles than its interceptors and countermeasures could possibly handle at once. Kirov was not just a warship. She was the flagship of an idea. That overwhelming a target with simultaneous multi-axis missile fire mattered more than winning any single duel ship-to-ship. 4 years after Kirov's maiden deployment, her sister ship Frunze was commissioned and assigned to the Pacific Fleet, giving the Soviet Navy a second carrier killer to threaten the American 7th Fleet across the Pacific theater. From the Sea of Japan to the waters off Vietnam, where Kirov haunted the North Atlantic and the Mediterranean, watching NATO's carrier battle groups on their own transit routes, Frunze extended that same shadow across an entirely different ocean. For the first time, American carrier commanders in 2 separate theaters had to plan every deployment around the knowledge that a Soviet battlecruiser might already be tracking them, feeding targeting data back to waiting submarines and bomber regiments hundreds of miles away. The American response to this threat was not built around any single new weapon. It was built around an entirely new doctrine, and it carried Kirov's name directly into its own planning documents. United States Navy strategists in the early 1980s formalized a concept called the outer air battle, explicitly designed to defeat the exact 3-part Soviet formation that Kirov commanded: backfire bombers, Oscar-class submarines, and Kirov-Class battlecruisers, acting together as a coordinated surface action group. The doctrine's logic was brutally simple. Once a saturation missile raid was actually in the air, no defensive system, however advanced, could guarantee stopping every incoming missile before it reached the carrier. The only reliable solution was to prevent the raid from ever launching in the first place. Naval aviators called this killing the archers before they could loose their arrows, and the aircraft built specifically for that mission was the F-14 Tomcat. carrying the long-range AIM-54 Phoenix missile, designed to intercept a backfire bomber formation from over 100 miles out before its crews ever got their own missiles into the air. The entire American naval aviation establishment of the 1980s, in other words, was partially organized around stopping a formation Kirov led. That alone tells you how seriously the ship was taken. No aircraft carrier group crossed the Atlantic or the Mediterranean without an outer air battle plan on the wall of its Combat Information Center, and Kirov's silhouette, or the silhouette of one of her sisters, was very often the reason that plan existed at all. Naval analysts on both sides ran the numbers on a hypothetical engagement for years. Wargaming. Exactly what would happen if a Kirov-led Wolfpack ever launched a full saturation strike against an American carrier battle group. The results depended entirely on which assumptions you fed into the simulation, but neither side ever walked away from those exercises feeling entirely confident. Pentagon planners believed the Navy could probably destroy the Oscar submarines and the surface ships before they fired. They were far less sure about stopping the backfires in time. It was, by any honest accounting, a genuinely even fight on paper, the kind neither superpower wanted to actually test in practice. And by every measure that mattered on paper, Kirov and her sisters were setting records no other surface combatant of the era could touch. At roughly 28,000 tons fully loaded, the class was more than 3 times the displacement of an American Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, and more than twice the size of almost anything else afloat that was not an aircraft carrier. Kaliningrad, later renamed Admiral Nakhimov, joined the fleet in 1988, followed the same year by the 4th hull, Yuri Andropov, later renamed Pyotr Veliky. 4 battlecruisers, each one nuclear-powered, each one carrying enough long-range firepower on its own to threaten an entire carrier battle group, gave the Soviet Navy something no navy in the world had fielded since the age of the actual battlecruiser died at the end of the Second World War. A class of surface ships that could, in theory, fight and win alone. Every American intelligence assessment written about the Soviet surface fleet through the 1980s mentioned Kirov near the top of the list, and for good reason. No other single vessel in either superpower's arsenal carried that particular combination of endurance, firepower, and independence. Washington's answer to Kirov was not limited to fighter jets and missile doctrine. When the Reagan administration built its case for a 600-ship Navy in the early 1980s, Kirov and her sisters featured directly in the argument, cited by name in congressional testimony, as proof that the Soviet Navy was no longer a coastal defense force, but a genuine blue-water challenger. Part of that same buildup even reached back into history. The Navy recommissioned all 4 Iowa-class battleships, ships that had been mothballed since the Second World War in Korea, partly because their 16-inch guns and heavy armor gave American task forces a kind of raw, close-range firepower that a missile cruiser could not easily replicate, and partly as a public, unmistakable signal that the United States could match Soviet displays of naval muscle ship for ship. It was a strange symmetry. A Soviet nuclear battlecruiser, the most modern warship afloat, had helped drag the ghosts of World War II battleships back into active service on the other side of the world. Inside the Soviet Union, Kirov served a second purpose entirely removed from Wolfpack doctrine and war games. She was propaganda. An effective propaganda at that. Soviet state media photographed her steaming past naval parades in foreign ports alike, holding her up as tangible proof that decades of investment in Admiral Gorshkov's Blue Water Navy had finally produced something the West could not casually dismiss. For a Soviet public fed a steady diet of claims about matching American power, an 800-foot nuclear battlecruiser sailing openly into the Mediterranean was concrete evidence, not just rhetoric. But for all the wargaming, all the doctrine written specifically to counter them, all the billions of dollars the United States spent building an entire generation of fighters and missiles around defeating them, the Kirov-class ships never once got the chance to prove any of it. Not a single Granite missile was ever fired at an American ship. Not a single outer air battle plan was ever executed for real. The class spent its entire Cold War career doing exactly what a deterrent is supposed to do, and nothing more. Shadowing NATO exercises, trailing carrier battle groups from international waters, sailing close enough to remind everyone watching exactly what they were capable of, and then sailing away again. It was, in its own strange way, the single greatest achievement of Kupensky's concentration doctrine. A warship so dangerous that an entire superpower reorganized its naval aviation around the fear of it, without that ship ever having to fire a shot to earn the fear. That fear, though, had been bought at a cost nobody in Leningrad had fully reckoned with. The same qualities that made Kirov so terrifying on paper, the sheer scale of her reactors, the density of her weapons systems, the complexity of coordinating an entire Wolfpack formation from a single flagship, were about to become the very things that could not be sustained once the money that built them started running out. Kupensky's concentration doctrine had one structural weakness built into it from the very beginning, and it had nothing to do with missiles or radar. It was arithmetic. A fleet built around many smaller ships can absorb the loss of any single hull and keep fighting. Lose one destroyer out of a formation of 20, and the formation still functions. A fleet built around 4 enormous, irreplaceable battlecruisers cannot absorb that same loss the same way. Damage one Kirov-Class reactor badly enough, and you have not lost 1/20th of your striking power. You have lost an entire quarter of the most powerful surface strike force the Soviet Navy possessed, all at once, with no smaller, cheaper hull waiting in reserve to take its place. The same philosophy that let one ship carry the firepower of an entire formation meant that one accident could cost the fleet the equivalent of an entire formation. That arithmetic became reality in 1990. Kirov, the ship that had started it all, the flagship whose sudden appearance off the Baltic a decade earlier had forced NATO to invent an entirely new doctrine just to counter her, suffered a serious accident in her reactor propulsion system while deployed in the Mediterranean. The exact technical details were never made fully public, in keeping with the secrecy that surrounded Soviet nuclear incidents throughout the Cold War, but the outcome was unambiguous. Kirov's power plant was crippled. She limped home and was placed in reserve that same year, effectively finished as a combat vessel, less than a decade after entering service. Under different circumstances, a damaged flagship might simply have gone into a shipyard for repair. But 1990 was not a normal year to need money from Moscow. The Soviet Union itself was less than 2 years from collapse, its economy contracting, its defense budget already being quietly cannibalized to keep basic government functions running. The repairs Kirov needed were never authorized. There was no money left to authorize them with. Instead, in one of the more quietly brutal ironies in the class's history, engineers began stripping usable components and spare parts directly off the crippled Kirov to keep her 3 sister ships running. The flagship that had once represented the Soviet Navy's single greatest concentration of striking power in one hull was reduced, within a decade, to a parts bin for the fleet she was supposed to lead. In 1992, in a renaming project that swept across the entire Soviet, now Russian surface fleet, Kirov lost even her original name, becoming Admiral Ushakov, named for an 18th century admiral instead of the revolutionary who had inspired her original commission. The political interference did not stop with Kirov herself. The 5th hull of the class, intended to be named Dzerzhinsky, after the founder of the Soviet secret police, had been under construction since the late 1980s. Following the same concentration doctrine, the same enormous nuclear power plant, the same layered weapons suite as her 4 sisters, she never got the chance to prove any of it. Construction was suspended in 1990 as funding collapsed, and the unfinished hull spent the next several years drifting between renaming projects, first as October Revolution, then briefly considered for completion under yet another name, before the entire effort was abandoned and the incomplete ship was eventually scrapped where she sat. An entire battlecruiser, roughly a 5th of the planned class, existed for years only as a rusting, half-built hull in a Leningrad shipyard, a physical monument to a naval budget that had run out of road. While the Soviet Union's single, irreplaceable battlecruisers were being cannibalized for spare parts, the American strategy Congress had chosen a decade earlier was quietly proving its worth. The Ticonderoga-class Aegis cruisers. built in numbers precisely because Congress had rejected a Kirov-sized answer as too expensive, kept rolling out of American shipyards through the very years the Soviet program was collapsing. If one Ticonderoga suffered a mechanical failure, the United States Navy still had 24 more in service and more under construction. There was no single point of failure to exploit. No flagship whose loss could quietly erase a quarter of the fleet's striking power overnight. The philosophy of distributed, replaceable firepower that American planners had bet on, largely for budgetary reasons rather than any grand strategic insight, turned out to be the philosophy that could actually survive a financial collapse. The philosophy of concentrated, irreplaceable firepower could not. The rot was not confined to the 4 combat hulls either. The Soviet Navy had also built a 5th vessel off the same basic design, a command and control ship named Ural, launched in 1983 to serve as a floating communications and intelligence platform using the same nuclear-powered hull. Ural suffered the identical fate as her armed sisters, only faster. She was decommissioned in 2001, her enormous operating costs simply impossible to justify in a post-Soviet Russian Navy that could barely fund fuel for its remaining surface fleet, and scrapping began less than a decade later. Every variation the Soviets had built on Kupensky's original concentration doctrine, whether armed with granite missiles or packed with communications equipment, was running into the exact same wall. A nuclear-powered giant is only as valuable as the treasury willing to keep it running. And that treasury, by the 1990s, simply did not exist. The rest of the class limped through the 1990s carrying that same lesson forward, ship by ship. Frunze, renamed Admiral Lazarev, in 1992 and still serving with the Pacific Fleet, went inactive in 1994 as funding for fuel, maintenance, and crew pay dried up across the entire Russian Navy. Not just the Kirov-Class. She was formally decommissioned in 1998, never to sail again. Her nuclear reactors eventually judged too degraded to safely refuel. Kalinin, commissioned in 1988 and renamed Admiral Nakhimov the same year as her sisters, fared little better, entering what was supposed to be a routine overhaul at the Sevmash shipyard that would ultimately stretch across nearly 3 decades. Only the 4th and final hull, commissioned in 1998 as Pyotr Veliky, managed to remain in continuous active service through the turn of the century, and even she was not immune to the same rot spreading through the rest of the class. In March 2004, the crisis that had been quietly consuming the Kirov-class for over a decade finally became public in the most alarming way possible. Russia's own fleet admiral, Vladimir Kurodov, the commander-in-chief of the entire Russian Navy, told reporters that Pyotr Veliky's reactor was in such poor condition that it could explode at any moment. The statement, whatever its underlying motive, whether genuine alarm or internal Navy politics playing out in public, sent the ship straight to port for a month of emergency inspections. Her crew, in a detail that captured the era's broader collapse better than any single reactor reading could, lost 1/3 of their pay during the layup. Subsequent examinations reportedly found no actual fault with the reactor, and Kurodov walked the comment back within hours. But the damage to public confidence was already done. A warship once designed to make an entire superpower reorganize its naval aviation doctrine out of fear now generated headlines, because its own commanding admiral was not certain it wouldn't explode in port. By the early 2000s, the Soviet Navy's grand answer to the American carrier group, the ship built to concentrate an entire formation's worth of firepower into a single, unstoppable hull, had been reduced to exactly one operational vessel, kept running through a combination of institutional pride and dwindling funds, while her sisters sat in various states of decay across Russian shipyards, their reactor cores growing more dangerous to touch with every year that passed without proper maintenance. There was a second enemy closing in as well, one that had nothing to do with budgets. Even fully funded and fully crewed, a ship the size of a Kirov-class battlecruiser was, by simple physics, one of the largest and most conspicuous radar and satellite targets afloat, exactly the kind of high-value, hard-to-hide asset that advances in reconnaissance satellites and precision-guided weaponry were making steadily easier to locate and steadily harder to protect. The concentration doctrine had assumed the ship's size and firepower would make her too dangerous to approach. As surveillance technology matured on both sides of the Cold War divide, that same size increasingly made her too large to hide. None of this was visible from the outside in any single dramatic moment. There was no dramatic sinking, no headline-grabbing defeat in open battle because the ship never fought the battle she was built for. Instead, the flaw revealed itself the way a slow leak sinks a ship, rather than a single hole below the waterline. One reactor accident here. One funding shortfall there. One admiral's offhand comment about a reactor that might explode. One incomplete hull scrapped where it sat. One command ship quietly decommissioned because nobody could afford to keep her running. By the time the pattern was fully visible, 3 of the 4 battlecruisers that had once made an entire superpower rewrite its naval doctrine were no longer capable of putting to sea at all. The concentration doctrine had won its argument on paper in the 1980s. By the 1990s, it was losing the only argument that actually mattered, the one against a budget that no longer existed. In 1999, the third hull of the class, Kalinin, renamed Admiral Nakhimov 7 years earlier, arrived at the Selvmash shipyard in Severodvinsk for what the Russian Navy described almost casually as a routine overhaul. Nobody involved used the word decision at the time. It looked administrative, one more line item in a defense budget still recovering from the chaos of the Soviet collapse. But it was, in hindsight, the single moment on which the entire fate of Kupensky's concentration doctrine would eventually turn. Russia now had 1 working battlecruiser, Pyotr Veliki, and 3 others in various states of ruin. It could have let Nakhimov join her sisters in slow decay, as it eventually did with Ushakov and Lazarev. Instead, almost by inertia rather than any grand plan, the ship went into the yard and stayed there. The first official timelines were, in retrospect, almost naive. Russian officials in the early years of the overhaul suggested the ship could rejoin the fleet by around 2010, a target that assumed steady funding and a straightforward refit. Neither assumption held. Money arrived in fits and starts through the tons, interrupted by economic downturns and competing defense priorities, and the technical scope of the job kept expanding. The deeper engineers got into a hull that had not moved under her own power in years. It was not until the early 2010s that the Russian Ministry of Defense formally approved a genuinely comprehensive reconstruction plan. The real decision point buried inside what had looked, a decade earlier, like routine paperwork. Work at Sevmash began in earnest around 2013. Strip the ship down to a bare hull. Replace her Soviet-era sensors and combat systems almost entirely. Fit her with modern long-range strike weapons, and try to bring 2 aging nuclear reactors back to life after more than a decade of dormancy. The price of that decision kept climbing every year the work continued. Estimates that once hovered in the hundreds of millions of dollars eventually grew into a figure widely cited near $5 billion, with some Russian-sourced estimates placing the total closer to 200 billion rubles, a figure that translates to roughly $2.5 billion depending on the exchange rate used and the year the comparison is made. Whichever number is closest to the truth, the pattern was unmistakable. Both major cost growth and repeated schedule slippage, year after year, on a single ship. For a useful point of comparison, the United States Navy's most advanced aircraft carrier, USS Gerald R. Ford, an entirely new class of warship built essentially from a blank sheet of paper, took 12 years to build from keel laying to commissioning. Russia would eventually spend more than twice that long rebuilding a single Cold War hull that already existed. By the mid-2020s, more than a decade into serious reconstruction work, and a full quarter-century after Nakhimov first arrived at the yard, the project finally began showing signs of a genuine ending. Her 2 KN-3 nuclear reactors, silent for over 2 decades, received new fuel elements and were restarted in stages between late 2024 and early 2025, the first of the pair coming back online in December, the second following on February 6. Engineers who had spent entire careers on this one hull watched instrumentation readings that many of them had likely never expected to see in their working lifetimes. On July 25, 2025, Nakhimov was formally refloated, and the following month she moved under her own power for the first time in 28 years, a ship built in the 1980s, finally answering her own engines again in a world that looked almost nothing like the one she had been designed to fight in. What followed was a slow, methodical march through sea trials that stretched across nearly a year. The ship departed Sevmash on May 31st, 2026, entering what the Russian Ministry of Transport called the final phase of testing, and by June 1st she was conducting comprehensive evaluations of her navigation, propulsion, combat, and defensive systems in the open water of the White Sea and beyond. By late June, satellite imagery placed her in Kola Bay, undergoing trials widely interpreted as the last major milestone before formal acceptance into the fleet. On July 21st, she returned to port at Severodvinsk following another round of at-sea testing. Russia's naval commander-in-chief, Admiral Alexander Moiseyev, would not commit publicly to an exact commissioning date, but he was willing to say the ship would join the fleet before the year was out. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," he told reporters. "I think we will carry out this year's plans." This year, comprehensive testing is underway. There is a detail in that timeline worth sitting with for a moment, because it says more about the cost of Kupensky's concentration doctrine than any budget figure can. The reconstruction of Admiral Nakhimov began before many of the young sailors who will eventually crew her were even born. An 18-year-old rating reporting for his first posting aboard the ship in her return to service year would have entered the world roughly a decade after the ship first arrived at the shipyard that was supposed to send her back to sea in a matter of months. The battlecruiser has, in a very real sense, outlived the career timeline of an entire generation of the sailors now inheriting her. The work itself, once it finally accelerated after 2013, amounted to something closer to rebuilding the ship from the inside out than repairing her. Engineers stripped away the Soviet-era Granite missile system that had once defined the entire class. The very weapons that gave Kirov her original carrier-killer reputation, and in its place fitted a vertical launch system with as many as 176 cells, the largest missile magazine on any surface warship in the world, capable of firing Kaliber cruise missiles, Onyx anti-ship missiles, and the newer Zircon hypersonic weapon that did not exist as an operational system when Nakhimov first entered the yard. It was, in effect, a different warship wearing the same hull, updated one generation of Soviet weaponry too late to matter to the Cold War she was built to fight, but arriving just in time to matter to a very different, and in some ways far uglier, era of Russian naval ambition. The refloating itself was a quieter event than the scale of the project might suggest. There was no christening bottle smashed across the bow the way Western press likes to imagine these moments. There was simply a dry dock slowly filling with water at Sevmash, tugboats standing by in the cold northern light, and a hull that had not felt open water beneath it in over a quarter century, settling back into its natural element for the first time since Bill Clinton's first term as American president. When she moved under her own power the following month, it was not dramatic to watch from shore, just a slow, deliberate churn of white water astern as two reactors that had sat cold and silent since the late 1990s finally turned her propellers again. The reckoning, when it finally arrived, did not look like the collapse of an aircraft factory or the disgrace of a purged designer. It looked like an invoice stretched across 27 years and roughly $5 billion. For a philosophy the Soviet Union had committed to in 1971 and never fully finished paying for. There was no single dramatic downfall to narrate here the way there might be for an engineer publicly stripped of his post or a factory shuttered overnight. Records of what became of Boris Kupensky himself after Project 1144 moved into production are thin in the sources available outside Russia. Unlike the aircraft designers of an earlier, more publicly documented era, the men who ran the Soviet Union's naval design bureaus largely worked and, presumably, retired inside a system built to keep their names out of the spotlight in the first place. What can be said with confidence is that the institution he led, the Severno Design Bureau in Leningrad, continued long after Kirov's commissioning, its name now carried forward by the very ship still fighting to finish the story he started. Even as she approached formal return to service, doubts trailed. Admiral Nakhimov the way they had trailed the entire class since the reconnaissance strike complex first sailed into the North Atlantic decades earlier. Naval analysts openly questioned how well two reactors that had spent more than 2 decades cold and unused would perform under sustained operational stress, and how much Russian commanders could reasonably place in a single, irreplaceable flagship, after everything the class had already been through. Some analysts wondered aloud whether Moscow would even risk deploying a ship this valuable, this expensive, and this hard to replace into genuinely contested waters, given how catastrophic the loss of a warship this size and this symbolic would be, both militarily and politically. The concentration doctrine had always carried that risk built into its foundation. A ship built to be worth an entire formation is also a ship whose loss costs exactly as much. The operators inherited a different kind of reckoning. The sailors who crewed Kirov, Frunze, and Kalinin through the final Soviet years, and the officers and engineers who spent decades keeping Pyotr Veliky alone at sea, while her sisters rusted, watched a design built to make them the tip of the Soviet Navy's spear become instead a byword for a fleet running on fumes. Fuel that was rationed. Pay that was cut. Reactors that a fleet admiral himself once suggested could explode without warning. For the generation of young sailors now training to crew a fully modernized Nakhimov, the inheritance is stranger still. They join a ship whose reputation was built entirely on deterrence rather than combat, a vessel that has never fired a shot at an enemy in nearly 50 years of existence, yet one still expected to carry the full symbolic and strategic weight of the doctrine that built her. And the workforce, the generations of engineers and shipyard laborers at Sevmosh, who spent an entire career, sometimes literally from apprenticeship to retirement, working on the same hull, inherited perhaps the strangest legacy of all, a warship whose reconstruction outlasted the working lives of some of the very people who built it. Shipyard employees who joined Sevmosh as young technicians in the year Nakhimov first arrived for her routine overhaul were, by the time she finally sailed again, old enough to have grandchildren serving in the very Navy that ship was rejoining. An entire professional lifetime, spent turning wrenches and running cable on one warship from one century into the next. By the summer of 2026, 27 years after Kalinin first arrived at Sevmosh as a routine overhaul case, Admiral Nakhimov stood on the edge of formally rejoining the Russian fleet, carrying more vertical launch cells than any surface combatant in the world, armed with hypersonic missiles that did not exist when she was first designed, and facing a question that no amount of new weaponry could fully answer: whether the concentration doctrine that had once made an entire superpower rewrite its naval aviation strategy still meant anything in a navy that could barely field more than one working example of it at a time. Whatever name history eventually settles on for this moment, it was not a battle lost, or a factory closed overnight, or a single order that doomed a single machine. It was a quarter century spent finding out exactly what it costs, in money, in careers, and in generations of shipyard labor, to keep one philosophy alive long after the war it was built to fight had already ended. The institution that built Kirov did not vanish along with the Soviet Union that commissioned her. The Severno Design Bureau, where Boris Kupensky once turned an 8,000-ton anti-submarine concept into a 28,000-ton battlecruiser, still exists today in St. Petersburg. Absorbed decades ago into the United Shipbuilding Corporation, the state-owned conglomerate that now controls nearly all of Russia's major naval construction, the Bureau continues designing surface combatants for the Russian Navy, a direct institutional descendant of the office that once dreamed up the largest non-carrier warships on Earth, the Baltic shipyard in St. Petersburg, the yard that laid every single Kirov-Class keel between 1974 and 1989, also survived the collapse and remains active under the same state umbrella, though its production lines today are given over almost entirely to icebreakers rather than battlecruisers. A telling shift in priorities for a Navy that no longer builds ships this size. The four hulls themselves scattered into four very different fates, and none of them ended the way Kupensky's original design brief imagined. Kirov, the ship that started it all, The flagship, whose 1980 debut off the Baltic forced an entire superpower to rewrite its naval doctrine, was renamed Admiral Ushakov in 1992 and never sailed again after her 1990 reactor accident. She sat in reserve for nearly 3 decades, while engineers debated whether her cores could ever be safely defueled. Russia finally decided in 2019 that the answer was no, and ordered her scrapped rather than repaired, with dismantlement costs at the Zvezdotka shipyard estimated around $40 million, a bill for tearing apart the very ship that had once cost an entire arms race to build. Frunze renamed Admiral Lazarev, went inactive in 1994 and was formally decommissioned in 1998, her reactors judged too degraded to refuel. She has spent the years since laid up and slated for the same eventual scrapyard fate as her lead sister. Ural, the fifth hull built to the same nuclear design as a floating intelligence platform, was decommissioned in 2001 and had already begun the scrapping process by 2010. Only 2 of the 5 ships built to this concentration doctrine remain in any meaningful sense today. Pyotr Veliky, still serving as the flagship of Russia's Northern Fleet, and Admiral Nakhimov, the sole hull judged worth the 27 years and roughly $5 billion it took to bring her back from the same kind of decay that consumed her sisters. Even Pyotr Veliky, the one hull that never stopped sailing, carries an unresolved question into her own future. She has now served continuously since 1998 without the kind of comprehensive ground-up reconstruction her sister received at Sevmosh, and Russian naval planners have discussed sending her through a similar modernization once Nakhimov's own refit finally concludes. Whether the Russian state, or its shipbuilding budget, still has the appetite for another 27-year multi-billion-dollar project once this one is finished, is very much an open question. One the ship's own crew cannot answer, and one that will likely depend far more on the state of a national economy than on anything happening aboard the vessel itself. That leaves the Kirov-Class, as a complete program, standing at an unusual crossroads for a warship class of its stature, neither fully retired into memory nor fully thriving in active service, but caught somewhere in between, one hull freshly reborn, one hull still sailing on borrowed time, and 3 others already gone or going. There is a pointed asymmetry worth noting here too, one that says something about how differently the 2 Cold War superpowers chose to remember their naval history. The United States preserved all 4 of its recommissioned Iowa-class battleships as museum ships, floating monuments that millions of visitors have walked the decks of since. No Kirov-class hull has been preserved for the public in anything like the same way. The ships that once forced the entire American naval aviation establishment to build a doctrine specifically around defeating them are one by one being cut apart for scrap metal in Russian shipyards, their story destined to live on mostly in intelligence archives, naval history books, and the occasional grainy Cold War surveillance photograph. Rather than in a preserved hull, the public can walk aboard. And yet the verdict on Kupensky's original philosophy is more complicated than the scrapyard fate of his ships would suggest. The idea at the heart of the concentration doctrine, that a single, heavily armed, multi-mission surface combatant could deliver more genuine striking power than a formation of smaller specialized ships, never actually died. It simply moved to a country with the industrial capacity and the political discipline to build it in numbers, instead of as a handful of irreplaceable giants. China's Type 055 destroyer, first commissioned in 2020, borrows unmistakably from the same basic logic Kupensky pioneered in Leningrad. Pack the sensors, the air defense, the anti-ship weapons, and the land attack capability of an entire escort formation into one very large hull. British and American defense analysts have openly noted that the Type 055, despite weighing less than half of what a Kirov-class ship displaces, may already outperform the Soviet design in overall combat capability. The critical difference is that China has built 8 of them, all operational, all commissioned within roughly 4 years of each other, rather than building 4 over 15 years, and then struggling to keep even one of them running for the following 3 decades. That comparison is the real historical verdict on this ship. Kupensky's engineering was never really the flaw. A single hull that could concentrate the firepower of an entire naval formation was. and remains a genuinely sound idea, one now being validated in a different ocean by a different navy with deeper pockets and steadier funding. What the Soviet Union, and later Russia, never solved was the economics underneath that engineering. How do you keep four irreplaceable, nuclear-powered giants running for 50 years on a budget that could barely survive the political and financial chaos of a single decade? The Kirov-Class was not defeated by an enemy fleet, or an enemy engineer, or a rival design that flew or sailed circles around it in combat. It was defeated by its own balance sheet, decade after decade, until only a fraction of what was built in triumph in the 1980s remained standing by the 2020s. To prove the original idea had ever worked at all, two navies looked at the same problem and answered it in opposite languages. The Kirov-Class was a masterpiece of concentration. Take everything a battle group needs, the missiles, the sensors, the armor, the endurance, and fold it into a single hull. So dangerous alone that an enemy has to plan around it the way they would plan around an entire fleet. One ship, carrying the weight of many. The Ticonderoga class and everything American naval doctrine built after it was a masterpiece of distribution. Take that same weight and spread it across a dozen hulls, 100 hulls, so that losing any single one costs you almost nothing, and building the next one costs you almost nothing either. Many ships carrying the weight of one idea. Concentration wins the argument on paper. It wins the war game. It wins the fear in an enemy admiral's chest the first time radar picks up that silhouette on the horizon. But concentration only wins for as long as the treasury behind it keeps writing checks, because everything staked on one hull is lost the moment that hull cannot sail. Distribution rarely wins the argument on paper. It is smaller, cheaper, less impressive in any single engagement, but it survives budgets. It survives accidents. Survives the kind of decade that brings down an empire, because no single failure is ever a failure of the whole. One philosophy produced 4 battlecruisers, and decades later, one still fighting to prove she belongs at sea. The other produced dozens of cruisers, quietly retired and quietly replaced, one generation after another, without ever once making the evening news. One philosophy is remembered in intelligence briefings and Cold War documentaries. The other is remembered, if at all, simply as the fleet that was still there when the argument ended. One philosophy left its finest ship afloat as a museum, a battleship any tourist can walk the deck of on a Sunday afternoon. The other left its finest ship afloat as a question mark, sailing again after 27 years in a shipyard, watched by naval analysts wondering whether her own government will ever risk sending her anywhere the answer actually matters. Kupensky built the ship that could be an entire formation by herself. Congress, almost by accident, chose the fleet that would never need to be. Neither man set out to write the ending this story actually got. But Kupensky was solving an engineering problem, not a budget problem, and by every engineering measure available to him in 1971 he solved it. It took a country on the other side of the world, 5 decades later, building the same idea in steel and missiles off its own coastline, to finally prove he had been right about the ship. He was simply never going to be right about the country built to sustain her. Remember where this story began. One ship alone, somewhere in the North Atlantic, carrying enough firepower to threaten an aircraft carrier from over the horizon, and an American Navy with nothing built to answer her directly. That was never really a victory. It was a debt, quietly accruing interest for the next 50 years, paid out in a reactor that could not be repaired, in a 5th hull scrapped before she ever touched water, in 27 years and $5 billion spent trying to prove that a single magnificent idea from 1971 still meant something in a century that had moved on without it. There is no dramatic wreckage to visit here. No burned-out factory floor. No single grave to stand beside. There is only a shipyard in the far north, a hull older than most of the sailors who will crew her, and a question that no amount of hypersonic missiles or vertical launch cells can fully settle, whether a 50-year-old philosophy, revived at enormous cost, can still do in 2026 what it was built to do in 1980, or whether the world it was designed to threaten has simply moved on to fighting its wars a different way. The Kirov-Class never lost a battle. It never had the chance to. What it lost, slowly, quietly, over 3 decades, was the argument about whether one ship should ever be asked to carry the weight of an entire navy. It was never really about the missiles.